Welcome to Last Neanderthals podcast. My name is Khushal and Dr.
And my name is Wali Khan. You may not know us yet, but that doesn't really matter. All you need to know is we are the Last Neanderthals. We are dedicated to having interesting and engaging conversations with individuals who have a lot of experience and an immense amount of knowledge. We hope to learn from these people and grow as human beings. We want you to listen and grow with us too. So come along the journey and evolve with us.
In today's episode, we spoke to Dr. Fiona Reynolds, the Chief Deputy Head of Children's Hospital in Birmingham, and the person who saved my sister's life, Malala Yousafzai. In our conversation, Dr. Fiona shares with us her journey to becoming a doctor and also shares with us the never-told story of her treating Malala. We also spoke about the crisis NHS is currently going through and the effects of COVID pandemic had on our society. This was the first podcast we have ever recorded, but not the first one we have published. We hope you find this podcast as insightful as we did. Thank you so much for listening.
My name's Fiona. I'm the Medical Director of Birmingham Women's and Children's. My very first job, I was contracted to work 96 hours a week.
That's great.
Malala had the right operation at the right time.
Some breaking news out of Pakistan. New hope for the brave young girl who was shot in the head for speaking out against the Taliban.
I saw her on the television. I was in Pakistan and she'd been shot.
The brave 14-year-old girl was directly targeted by the Taliban last week.
And Malala needed the right intensive care. So she got moved to Rawalpindi, and that's where I got involved because I'm an intensive care doctor. It's a miracle that she got to hospital alive.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
I think the first thing to say is to remind everyone how dangerous COVID was. Companies had done a lot of research to develop the vaccine quickly. They had developed 90% of it. They were just waiting for a virus to come along. And I know we wouldn't have got out of the pandemic as quickly and safely as we did without vaccines.
Speaking of the difficult choices doctors have to make, what's the most difficult choice you have made in your career?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Thank you for joining us, Fee. You're a good friend of mine. Would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself?
All right, yes. So my name's Fiona. I'm a doctor at the Children's Hospital here in Birmingham. I'm the Medical Director of Birmingham Women's and Children's. I've been a consultant at the hospital for a long time. And we met a long time ago in 2012 in Pakistan. And that's an interesting story. But yeah, local doctor and and a family friend, I think.
I think more than a family friend now. I consider you as almost like my god, not almost, as my godmother. So, you operated on my sister Malala, and, there were very tough times, and you were one of the people who saved her life, and I was very lucky to meet you when we first met. Would you like to tell us how we first met? I think that's a very interesting, I think that's where we should start the conversation. How do we know each other?
How do we know each other? So in 2012, I was in Pakistan with a group of doctors from Birmingham. We were visiting a hospital in Rawalpindi, and I happened to be in the country when your sister was shot, and the chief of the army staff wanted an opinion on your sister and asked the doctors I was with if one of us could give an opinion, and I was the right type of doctor to give a clinical opinion on how your sister was. So that's how I met your sister, and your sister was moved to the hospital I was visiting in Rawalpindi, and I was part of the team that helped look after her. And because I met her, I met all of your family. And how I met you, you were, how old were you?
I think I was about 12 or 13.
Yeah, I think you were about 12 or 13. And it was late at night one night. I was in the intensive care unit visiting your sister, and I came out and your dad wanted me to see you guys. You guys were supposed to be asleep. It was really late. And Atal, your little brother, who was 8 at the time, was fast asleep in the lower bunk of a bunk bed, and you were awake on the top bunk. And I can remember you looking at me and smiling and and put your head back down because you were supposed to be asleep. But I can remember thinking that your entire world had been turned upside down. And that was the first time we met. And we didn't meet again until your sister had been moved to Birmingham. And you came to Birmingham some 10 days after your sister had come to Birmingham to be looked after in Birmingham. And I can remember meeting you along with your brother and your mother in your sister's room at the hospital that she was looked after in Birmingham. So you were 12, you were a kid really, and your one prized possession was your PSP. You had some kind of handheld computer device that you loved playing with. So yeah, that was a long time ago. That's more than a decade ago. And I've watched you grow up from a kid that was obsessed with his PSP to the young man you are now. And I'm very, very proud of you.
Yes, I'm confident to say you were my first friend because you took us around. We didn't know the language. We felt really lost. Yeah. And, you know, they say like true love is the people you can be vulnerable with, and true friendships are made in the darkest times. But before that, I would love to know, like, what were you even doing in Pakistan? What got you into medicine? So in order to understand that, I think it's better that we start with your childhood. So what were you like in your childhood?
Right. I was probably a quite intense child. I was bright. I really enjoyed science and I was good at it. And I thought, what do you do with science if you're really good at it? And I suppose in my head, I had two options. I could either become a scientist or I could become a doctor. And I liked people and I liked talking to people. And there were some doctors that I knew who I found inspirational. So I ended up with my sort of abilities in science and my sort of inspirational characters that were in my life. I thought, I'm going to become a doctor. So I got really good grades at school. Thoroughly enjoyed school. And then I got my eyes set on, I wanted to do medicine and I wanted to study it in Edinburgh. And with the grades I got, I was able to go and study medicine in Edinburgh. And I had a great time at medical school. It was hard work, but it was also a lot of fun. And I made some friends that I'm friends with sort of 30 odd years later. So it was a formative time, high school and medical school. And then back when I was a young doctor, it was long hours. My very first job, I was contracted to work 96 hours a week.
That's crazy.
Wow.
Which was absolutely mad. And I can remember my first long weekend, which started on a Friday morning, and I had to work through to the Monday evening. And I was on call for the whole time. And during that whole time, I got 4 hours sleep. And back in the early 90s, when I was first a doctor, you had to do your own filing. There weren't ward clerks to do your filing. So I was filing results, and I couldn't actually remember the alphabet. I was so tired, I couldn't recite the alphabet. I had all of these results, and I was trying to put them into alphabetical order to file them, and I was so tired. And that's what it was like for young doctors back then, that you worked horribly hard, and you were probably so tired. I think we probably made mistakes. I was still allowed to prescribe drugs that afternoon, and I couldn't actually remember the alphabet. Fortunately, no one asked me to prescribe drugs that afternoon, but it was a different world from how medicine is nowadays in this country.
That's amazing. So you set your mind to something at such a young age, and then you achieved it as well.
Yeah, I've wanted to be a doctor since I was about 8 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing. And what was that journey into medicine like back then? Was it similar to how it is now, or were there differences?
I think it was very similar to how it is now. I think the similarities are that you've got to be pretty academic, but you also have to enter medicine. They expect you to have a life outside of academic studies, so you had to do other things. So I did Duke of Edinburgh, I was in the guides, I did first aid, so I had lots of outside interests, because to be a doctor you have to be a rounded character. It can't all just be the academic, because otherwise you wouldn't have an interest in people. And to be a doctor, you've got to be academic, but you've also got to be interested in people, and they've got to see evidence of that. I suppose the one thing that was different back then to how it is now was I never had an interview for university. To go to Edinburgh University, I did not have an interview, and most people have an interview to get into university now. And when I went to university, it was about 1 in 10 kids of 18 went to university, and it's far more now. So I suppose I was lucky to be academic enough and well-rounded enough to go to university. But it was very similar, and it was the same hard work. I think things have changed, that there's more problem-based learning at university, but mine was very much bookwork and exams every 2 weeks. Throughout university, first 3 years of university, we had exams every 2 weeks, and you were supposed to pass them. People didn't pass them all, but we took them seriously, and it showed that you were learning the whole time, the fact that you were being assessed the whole time.
Was there any point on your journey that you were having second thoughts about becoming a doctor? Especially that, you mentioned that the workload was so much that you forgot your alphabets.
So at university, I can remember thinking every few weeks we'd do a different topic, and it bore no relation to any other topic I'd ever learned before. And I can remember in my mind thinking, it's like climbing a mountain every 2 weeks. I've got to learn something new every 2 weeks and get to know the subject matter. And I found that hard, but I developed a mindset that it was basically, you had to just keep climbing those mountains. You had to keep learning, otherwise I wasn't going to get there. So I didn't have any doubts at medical school that it's what I wanted to do, and that I just had to keep working hard to understand the material, but also have fun, because 18, 19, 20, life's about having fun. And then when I became a doctor, I knew what it was going to be like, because as a medical student, we saw the junior doctors work this hard. So I knew it was coming to me and that I was going to have to work this hard. And then as I became a more senior junior doctor, about 3-4 years in, they actually cut the hours. They actually reduced the hours you could work. And the first reduction was to 72 hours a week. And I can remember thinking, I only have to work 72 hours now. That's just amazing that I'm going to have free time, which I really didn't have in my first couple of years. And by the time I finished being a junior doctor, the maximum I was allowed to work was 56 hours a week. So that felt even better. So through my training, which took about 13 years to get to where I wanted to be, the hours got reduced the whole time. And then when I became a consultant, I was working about 48 hours a week. And then junior doctors' hours went down to 48 hours a week. That's still more than most people work. And of course, the other thing is doctors work shifts throughout their life. So last night I was on call, and at 1 o'clock in the morning last night, I was actually in the hospital. So I've accepted, and it's part of my life that I get up at night to look after patients, because you can't predict when someone's going to get sick. So yeah, I enjoy my job, and I've always been committed to it, and I've never had any doubts that this is what I wanted to do.
That's amazing. And I think that's a really important part of medicine as well, that fulfillment you get from being a doctor. But working that hard also probably has like its downsides to it, especially these days. We've seen junior doctors striking, and they're asking for a pay rise because of how many hours they work. So in your time when you were a junior doctor, was this same happening as well, because you were working even more hours?
No, when I was a junior doctor, I was paid far more than my contemporaries who'd graduated. So that's not true anymore. Junior doctors don't get paid much more than other graduates, whereas there was a big differential when I first graduated, such that very quickly I was able to buy a house, buy a car. So I was better off than most of my contemporaries in terms of finances, but they had more time. So, throughout my life, I've had to miss birthdays, Christmases, parties, weekends because I've been working, and that's something I've understood and accepted. And I got a financial reward for that. I don't think junior doctors get that financial reward in the same way I did, so I can understand why they're taking issue with the fact they're not paid as well as I was when I was a junior doctor.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because it's become more saturated, medicine has become more saturated, or do you think it's just the government's priorities are different?
I think it's a combination of things. I think that part of it is government priorities are different, because if you look at other countries, junior doctors are paid more in other countries. There are some countries that are comparable, but I think there are places like Australia where junior doctors are paid much more. I think the hours are different now. I think they work more intensely because patients are sicker than I ever did. So when I was working a 96-hour week, I was able to go to bed and sleep at night if there was nothing to do, whereas junior doctors don't have that luxury now. The patients are sicker and they've got to be on their feet working at night. I also think that there are more doctors now, and as a result, I think the country can afford less because we do have more doctors than we did 30 years ago. So I think society and the government have made a decision that doctors are going to be paid less. And to some extent that's making the career less attractive. It means that we're not going to retain the brightest minds, and that it's going to be difficult to keep doctors in this country, because I know a lot of junior doctors are leaving to go and work overseas. I went overseas for 2 years to train. It was part of my training. I always intended to come back. When I was training in paediatric intensive care, you couldn't train in this country. I had to go overseas, so I went to Australia for 2 years, but always with the intention of coming back and practicing in England.
That's very unfortunate, because imagine, let's say you had similar challenges to what the doctors are experiencing, and you let's say you quit medicine, and then you won in Pakistan, you didn't operate on my sister. Like the actual impact, the ground impact, we see like the statistics and the surface level, right? Or doctors are just striking, but the consequences of that are severe. So what are some of the consequences, like in terms of like the grand scheme of things? Yeah.
Okay. So I think the first thing is, in the immediate, right now, we are seeing that doctors are leaving the country and leaving the profession. And that brain drain is going to have an impact. Beyond that, I think there's a problem with morale, that junior doctors are feeling undervalued. And the National Health Service has always relied on discretionary effort, people going above and beyond. And I think people are less willing to go above and beyond to make that extra effort, wait that extra hour, do that extra research project, make that change that will make everybody's lives easier on the ward. So I think that there's a huge detriment in the short to medium term to the NHS of people not going the extra mile. And I think long term, we've got a shortage of GPs. So there are GPs who run practices who are partners, and they usually have a huge investment in running the business and developing the business. And there are salaried GPs, and I think more and more doctors want to be salaried GPs so that they can put boundaries around their job and maintain a better work-life balance. And I also think that there's a sort of generational issue coming through, that people like me expected to work 80-odd hours a week. And I think the younger generation want a different work-life balance. So there are consequences. I would not want to go back to working the hours I worked as a young doctor. I would not want that for any of our young doctors. But the problem of salaries being higher overseas and junior doctors feeling undervalued is going to have a huge impact on patient care. At the end of the day, patient care and moving medicine forward, and it's an unfortunate position that we're in.
Do you think that's one of the main problems that NHS is facing right now? And what other problems do you think, what are the other biggest problems that NHS is facing?
The single biggest problem that the NHS is facing is the challenge of the workforce. We have an important job to do to recover from COVID. We had waiting lists that were going up before COVID, and of course COVID meant that there was a lot of elective surgery and procedures that were reduced. And the other issue is we've got an ageing and more delicate, vulnerable population. Older people are living longer with far more complex illnesses, and so are children. Children who used to die now survive and have care needs, healthcare needs. And we quite simply are struggling to have the number of staff and the right staff with the right skills to look after the population. And the truth is that we're going to have to find new ways of working. Worldwide, there aren't enough healthcare workers. There's no country in the world got enough healthcare workers. We're all trying to basically attract healthcare workers into the workforce and from other countries, and that means that people are attracted by best salaries and people will move country because healthcare workers can move country relatively easily in terms of licensing. As long as you can speak the language and your license is recognised, you can be relicensed in another country. So the single biggest challenge that the NHS has got is it needs the right workforce with the right skills, and it takes a long time to develop those skills. And quite simply, we don't have enough people with the right skills. And I think the place I see it most obviously is actually in mental health services. You see it in physical health services, but even more so in mental health services. And that's something around parity of esteem, that many healthcare workers want to do physical healthcare rather than mental health care. And most people, when you think about it, most people think, well, if I can only have one, my physical health or my mental health, most people would choose, I'd want my mental health to be good. I could put up with a bit of physical disability. And people with mental health problems, it's so common to have mental health problems, and it's so disabling, and it impacts so much on life that you want to have a mental health service that's strong and is going to be able to meet all your needs, and it's not going to have a major waiting list, because the last thing you want is to have a mental health crisis or a mental health problem and not be able to access care. So the issue with mental health staff is we don't have enough of them, and we don't have enough of them with the right skills. And of course that means patients have to wait, and quite simply you don't want to wait if you've got a physical health problem, and especially if you've got a mental health problem.
Yeah, definitely. And what steps do you think can be taken to alleviate those problems a little bit? Because everyone in this country prides themselves on the NHS, that we have public healthcare, but at the moment it is in a crisis. So what steps do you think can be taken to kind of revitalise it a little bit?
So we do talk about the crisis in the NHS, but do remember that every day there are miracles happening all over the NHS. We are doing hundreds and hundreds of operations, treatments. There are patients getting treatments that have never been available before, and complex drugs, advanced therapies are coming on the market all the time that are helping people in ways that just weren't possible before. But what I do recognise is we're not meeting all of the needs of the population. And the types of things that we've got to think about are retaining staff, so getting the right people in through training, but once they're here, I'd like to keep the junior doctors in this country, and part of that is making sure that they're getting the right salaries that are attractive. Salaries, part of it is that you want to keep staff, and it's not just about doctors, it's about nurses, it's about therapists, it's about scientists, it's about psychologists, it's about pharmacists. It definitely isn't just about junior doctors. You want to be able to keep those people and develop them. And so many people now want to have a job that they develop into. They don't want to do the same job for 30 years. I certainly am not doing the same job I was doing 30 years ago. They want to maximise their skills. They want to see that they're learning new things, that they're basically being developed as professionals, and that is really important. I think as well as having the right staff and enough of the right staff with the right skills, we should use technology more. We can monitor people in a way that we've never been able to, rather than going to see the doctor regularly to have checks. We can do physical health checks with remote monitoring, with technology. And we in the UK have not maximised the potential of that. I don't think anybody in the world has, but there are places that do it better than us. So I think we've got that to take on board. And the other thing that we really are only just beginning to understand is how peers can help each other. So you can have peer support if you've got a mental health problem, or perhaps if you're a diabetic, or if you're a pregnant woman, having peer support to explain perhaps not the medical stuff, but the how to cope. Because in, 20, 30, 40 years ago, you would have the nuclear family, and the grandma might be able to explain something in the family. The child's got a cold, you don't need to take that baby to the doctor. I think the baby's okay. Whereas if you've lost that sort of wisdom in the family because you've moved away and you've not got grandma to ask, you take the baby to the doctor. And we've kind of lost that. So that ability to do peer support, the world of mental health has really pioneered that peer support. And we actually now have peer support workers who are paid to support other people who are having who are in mental health services, because it helps them navigate it, it helps them ask the right questions, it helps them remember to get their prescriptions, or how to get their prescriptions. So those sorts of things can really help patients navigate their way through health services.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. For example, in Pakistan, we have some of the best doctors, but because we got deficiency in technology, please correct me if I'm wrong, was that one of the main reasons why Malala was moved here? Also because of the rehabilitation program?
Yeah. So you said earlier I operated on your sister. I'm not a surgeon. I don't operate. I look after children in intensive care. But when your sister was shot, I wasn't in the town where your sister was shot at the time, but Malala had the right operation at the right time by an amazing neurosurgeon who was really, really well trained. And quite simply, he saved her life. If he hadn't operated that night, when she got really sick and she had a blood clot, she wouldn't have been alive. And that doctor went up against a lot of opposition to do that operation, including your dad, who was worried that he might not be the right doctor. And that doctor knew he was the right doctor, and he knew he had to do it very quickly. And he persuaded your father, yes, we need to do this operation.
Was that in Pakistan?
Yeah, that was in Pakistan. So the Malala had her operation in Peshawar, and the neurosurgeon there knew that there was no time to move her to Rawalpindi or overseas, and there was some pressure on him to move her, and he knew that the operation was so urgent it just had to take place that night, and he had to do it, and he was very well trained, and he also advocated for his patient. He knew that despite the opposition, he had to do it, and I completely agree. Looking at it in the cold light of day, he had to do it. And he had the skills and the ability to do that operation and save her life. What Pakistan has got are some great skilled nurses and doctors and other healthcare professionals, but it doesn't have enough of them, and it doesn't necessarily have them in all the right places. And Pakistan has some superb hospitals that are as well kitted out as some American hospitals or British hospitals with all the right kit, but not all of the hospitals in Pakistan do have all the right kit. So, you know, every hospital could do with more kit, but the hospitals in Pakistan were good, and the hospital in Pakistan saved your sister's life, but she got moved to Rawalpindi because the hospital in Peshawar didn't have enough intensive care facilities. It didn't have the right intensive care facilities. And I'm an intensive care doctor, and I helped the doctors move her from Peshawar to Rawalpindi because the outcome after brain surgery is not just dependent on the brain surgery, it's also dependent on the aftercare, and the aftercare is intensive care. And Malala needed the right intensive care, and she wasn't really getting it in Peshawar. So she got moved to Rawalpindi to have the right intensive care, and that's where I got involved because I'm an intensive care doctor. But the reason Malala came to England was for rehabilitation, because at the time rehabilitation services were in their infancy in Pakistan, and because of where she was shot and the where the blood clot was and the fractured skull, we didn't know how much rehabilitation Malala would have. We knew that she'd have some problems with her ear, but we knew that she had a long road to recovery, and she's made a fantastic recovery. I'm so pleased, with the recovery she's made. But she was going to be better with rehabilitation in England, and that's why the Pakistan government decided to send her to England to have the rehabilitation that she needed, because everybody wanted absolutely to maximise her recovery.
When was the first time you heard of Malala? Was it when the incident happened, or did you know of her beforehand?
I didn't know of her beforehand. I didn't know of her until I was in Pakistan and she'd been shot. I saw her on the television and I knew it must be a big deal. I was in an office and there were two TVs. One had Geo News, which is Pakistan's local news, and one had Sky News, and they both had the same feed at the top of the hour. So it was the top news story on Geo News, but it was also the top news story in Sky News. And I realised that this was part of Pakistan I was looking at. And obviously I could, the TVs didn't have sound, but I could read the subtitles, and it was that she'd been shot in Pakistan. I thought, wow, I'm in Pakistan, this child's been shot in Pakistan, and it's made Sky News as the top news story. So that's when I first heard of Malala. And I couldn't say your surname. I could read Malala, but I looked at your surname written on the Sky News sort of banner at the bottom, and I thought, I don't know how to say that surname. But that's when I first knew that she'd been shot. And a few hours later, that was in the morning, and that afternoon, I was asked by the Pakistan military if I would give an opinion on her, because I am an intensive care doctor, but a paediatric intensive care doctor. And Pakistan at the time didn't have too many of those. So I got involved in giving an opinion that day. And then the following day, I helped move her from Peshawar to Rawalpindi to what is the intensive care in Rawalpindi was as good as any intensive care I've ever been in anywhere in the world. It was absolutely brilliant intensive care. And that's where Malala had her intensive care after surgery.
And was it your decision or your recommendation to move her from Peshawar? Was there any resistance in moving her from Peshawar?
So the day after she was shot, I went to Peshawar and to give an opinion. I was asked to give an opinion. And I didn't think that the facilities and the training and the intensive care in Peshawar was as good as the intensive care in Rawalpindi. I'd been in Rawalpindi working in the intensive care unit. I said, look, you should move this child to the best intensive care unit you've got. And the one in Rawalpindi is very, very good. Move her there. And I was told that Pakistan couldn't, that moving critically ill people is something that doesn't happen in Pakistan at the time. Transport medicine and transport intensive care was a new specialty in England, but it was something that I'd done for about a decade. And the Pakistan authorities, the Pakistan doctors, thought she was too sick to move. And I said, she's probably too sick not to move. So I was then asked for an alternative opinion. And my alternative opinion was to move intensive care doctors to her. And that happened that night. So my alternative suggestion happened straight away. Now, the intensive care doctors that went to look after her in Peshawar were very well trained. I knew them. I'd worked with them in Rawalpindi, but I'd also worked with them in Birmingham. So I knew these doctors and nurse very, very well. And they were absolutely fantastic. And they phoned the following day and asked to speak to me and said that Malala's condition had deteriorated and they thought that she needed to be moved to Rawalpindi, that, you know, they felt that we had a window and she had to move now. She had become septic and there were complications, and they weren't confident that they had all of the knowledge. They didn't have the experience, the recent experience to move her. So they asked if I could help, and that is something that I do a lot of, is move children from hospitals to my hospital in Birmingham, because most hospitals don't have a children's intensive care, so it's part of my specialty. So I got involved in moving Malala from Peshawar to Rawalpindi, and that's when I first met your dad. I'd seen Malala the previous day, but your dad wasn't around. But the day we moved her, I met your dad and I told her that I thought that the best thing for her was to move her to Rawalpindi.
So even you being there in that moment was basically miraculous. Like, so many miracles occurred for her to be who she is and where she is now, which is just the amazing person we all know, and healthy as well. It's just mad to think about, I think. And also, what was the actual problem? Because I think most people understand that she was shot in the head, and most people know that it's not good to get shot in the head. But I think what people don't understand is, firstly, how she survived after that, and what actually happened inside.
Yeah. Very few people survive being shot at point blank range in the head. And it's a miracle that she got to hospital alive. The bullet hit her above the eyebrow, on the left side of her head, and somehow it didn't enter her skull but seemed to traverse. And I don't know the path. It might have been inside, it might have been outside, but it fractured her skull badly. It went through her inner ear and affected her hearing on the left side, and it went down through her neck and ended up behind her shoulder. So I think she'd probably bent forward, and the bullet actually was removed by the neurosurgeon from her back, basically at her shoulder.
That's Dr. Junaid, right?
That's Dr. Colonel Junaid, yeah. So she was semi-conscious and was taken to hospital, and she was monitored carefully. She was scanned, and they could see that she had fractured her skull and that her brain basically looked a bit bruised under the fractured skull. And they monitored her, and a blood clot developed, which can happen some hours after the injury. So she was shot going home from school, and in the sort of late evening she became more unconscious, and a blood clot had developed in her CT scan. She had another CT scan. They could see the blood clot, and they knew that they had to take that blood clot out. And the way she deteriorated was she became more unconscious, and one of her pupils blew. So she had a big pupil, and that was an indication that her brain was under severe pressure and that the blood clot had to come out that night. So Colonel Junaid, the neurosurgeon, told everybody that she needed to be operated. It was an emergency. He had some resistance. It was political. There was some resistance, but he advocated for his patient. He's a very, very good doctor. He also told your father that it needed to happen, and Zaidin wasn't sure. He was a father whose child had been shot, and he was in a bad place. But Colonel Junaid knew what had to happen, and he took her to the operating theatre and operated that night. And what he did was he took out the blood clot. Off the surface of the brain there was bruising and there were bits of bone, and he basically took those off. And he also took a large piece of skull and took it off and put it in her abdomen. And that allowed the brain to swell, because this brain wanted to swell. It was an injured brain, and any part of the body will swell. And that part of the brain wanted to swell, and rather than swelling inwards and causing an increased pressure inside her skull, it was able to swell outwards. It was a bruised, sore brain. It was able to swell outwards and not cause any secondary damage. What happened then was, after she had the surgery, she was kept in a drug-induced coma to basically rest the brain and try to stop further pressure and swelling effects. So she was kept in intensive care. She was on a ventilator, so on a breathing machine. She was on heavy sedation and monitoring to make sure that her vital signs were stable. But despite the level of monitoring, she got sicker. And that often happens after brain injury. She had some infection. Her heart had actually, her blood pressure wasn't good, and her heart was needing heart support drugs. So she was on an adrenaline infusion. And this was the 2 days after she'd been shot. And they were very keen. The doctors that I'd suggested go and look after her knew then that she had to go to Rawalpindi, and I said that I could help move her, because that was my experience in moving critically ill children, and it wasn't their experience. But Colonel Junaid had also done other things. Malala had a tracheostomy for a short period of time to help her breathe, because they were worried about neck swelling, because this bullet had obviously gone down through her neck. And he had taken the bullet out. I've never found out what happened to the bullet, but it came to be lodged just over her shoulder blade, just under the skin, and he took it out. But she could have died at a number of points in time. She could have died when she was shot. She could have died if Colonel Junaid hadn't done the operation at the right time, and she could have died when she got sicker in intensive care. And it's awful to think. And
yeah,
I know that her brothers,
Yeah.
her brothers and her family find this difficult. To Malala, it's a story that she doesn't know firsthand, because she was unconscious the whole time. So her brothers, who are sitting in this room, remember it as children and remember the fear of that she might die and what was going to happen. And they ended up having to come to England, and it turned their lives upside down. And they're probably more traumatised than their sister is, because she actually doesn't have a memory of it. And I know this is hard for Khushal and Atal and Malala's mum and dad. Malala knows the story, but it's almost like
She's so brave, but
she's so brave.
But I feel like she's quiet about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like
she doesn't talk about it.
she doesn't talk about it. Like, one of the things Abba mentions, maybe he praises her for this, right? But it's also kind of concerning at the same time that after getting shot, after going through the pain she did, like, she's never complained about it.
No.
She's never complained about it enough. Sometimes I feel guilty because for me to process my trauma, it resulted in a lot of anger issues, me trauma dumping to my friends, And yeah, part of me is like, did I cause her more problems? Did I put more pressure on my sister? Did I make her feel like, I've went through all of that, like, no, here's my family, or another burden I have to bear. Yeah.
I think it's important to remember, like, now you guys are such an amazing, happy, healthy family who all get along. So that's the most important thing. That's all that matters. So you can't feel guilty about anything. You don't even do anything to feel guilty about in the first place.
Malala describes it as her second life. I've actually got a very good friend who had a very severe collapse and was unconscious and nearly died. And he doesn't remember any of it either. And he describes it as a second life. And he's very calm about it, whereas all of his family are traumatised because they lived the trauma of him being in hospital and being unconscious and not knowing if he was going to live or die. And I don't know if it's common for people who have been through something absolutely awful that they've got no memory of, and they wake up at the other end of it. Now, Malala was in a lot of pain. She had terrible headaches for the first few months after being shot in the head. But she's described it as a second life, whereas for you guys, it was part of your life. Whereas Malala, there's a bit missing, and she's described as a second life. And I don't know how people who face death actually can rationalise it. And I've never seen her upset about it. I saw her in pain. She's got an extraordinary pain threshold because she had a lot of headaches for a while after she was shot. But describing it as a second life and getting on with the life, and she talks about her childhood and she talks about school and all sorts of things, but it's very difficult for her to talk about actually what happened when she was shot because she doesn't know. It's all second hand, and occasionally something will be said and she'll say, oh, that happened. I didn't know that happened. Whereas everybody, Khushal and Atal remember that happening and she doesn't.
That's so fascinating. I remember meeting you guys. This wasn't the first time we met, but this was after Malala had recovered a bit. And then as well, you could see the impact it had had on her physically. But she seemed to be like okay with everything that had happened. Like, it's like she had processed it and she was just a young girl living her life, like having fun, joking, playing games. Like Athol was playing card games, like magic tricks on us. It was just a really good environment. And I remember my family afterwards, we were just so impressed with how you guys were handling everything. So I think that is very admirable in itself as well, and something to celebrate for you guys.
Yeah, I think that's also, thank you so much, first of all, for your kind words. I think that's just the spirit of my parents. I think my father was very hopeful, and I don't know how he, dealt with all that facade that was happening. What was he like during this whole process?
Your father was amazing. He was a tower of strength for the family. He was obviously very worried that your sister was going to die. He was looking for hope. People who are in their darkest hour often do look for hope. And somebody at the hospital had said to him, go and pray. And he took that to mean that there was nothing more that could be done except for him to pray. And he asked me if there was hope. And I said the reason I'd come back to Peshawar to help was there was hope. That I did have hope that she could survive. I was worried that there may be brain damage. I didn't know what kind of brain damage or what severity of brain damage. There isn't, but I was worried that there could be. And I was very honest with your father. It was very, very obvious that you were a close-knit, very loving family. And it's a stereotype for me that I can remember telling your father to explain everything to your mother, because your dad obviously spoke English, but your mum didn't. And I was sitting in a room, and it was just your mum and dad there, explaining things to them. And I was worried that he was censoring what he was saying to your mother. And I now know that was definitely not the case. But I said to him, you've got to say everything that I'm saying exactly as I'm saying it. Don't put your own spin on it.
Or sugarcoating it.
Don't sugarcoat it. You've got to say what I'm saying, because that's the only way. I says, Malala's mother has a complete entitlement to know everything that I know. There's stuff that I don't know, and if I don't know, I'll say I don't know. But I need her to know everything. There was a different occasion where there was a woman in the room. It was a family friend who spoke English, and she explained that your dad was explaining absolutely everything I said to your mother. And I can remember thinking that I was surprised. I shouldn't have been. Now I know you, I shouldn't have been surprised. But I was surprised at the time that your father didn't believe in the patriarchy and was a feminist and was going to explain everything to your mother. And now I know him well. There is just no option that he would ever have sugarcoated it or in any way not said everything I was saying. And I didn't even need to say that to him. Yeah. But I did. And that was my fault because I was making an assumption about him that was completely false.
I'm very proud of, how my dad dealt with that. But although I felt like he kind of kept me in the blue a bit and I wasn't really sure what was going on. But I remember your thumbs up, how you would give my family the thumbs up and that would give me the reassurance. Like, okay, things are good. But what's crazy is that, and this is not known to many people, is that I never saw Malala in intensive care. At the time, I was very mad because I was like, I want to visit my sister. And, in the Peshawar, when the operation took place by Dr. Junaid, Colonel Junaid, when he did the operation, I wasn't there either because Atul and my mum, they left in a rush to Peshawar and they left me in Swat Valley. And I remember being at my cousin's hostel and watching the news. And, you know how the strip goes down. And I'm like, any second they could say that Malala has passed away. And I was literally creating scenarios in my head. Will I do something silly like commit suicide? How will I live with myself? But somehow I met you guys at Rawalpindi, and then those days feel like blur. And yeah, it's very difficult to talk about. The reason why I'm stuttering and I'm pausing is because I'm bringing a lot of things out of surface that I've kind of kept away, that I still haven't quite processed. So, speaking about this trauma and processing things, were you worried about Malala's rehabilitation? And did you think that there might be any disabilities, and what were the chances of that? And then just the mental health aspect that came later, because what she went through is unthinkable and unimaginable.
Yeah. So having seen her brain scans and knowing where the bullet travelled, I was worried that she may end up with the symptoms of a stroke. So I was worried that her right arm and leg might be weak, and that her what you call the eloquent area of the brain. The eloquent area of the brain is where you understand language, so you understand and are able to speak. And I was worried that part of the brain may be affected. So those were the things I was worried about looking at the CT scans, because those parts of the brain were very swollen. And they're not. She woke up and her right arm and leg were normal power, and that she speaks 3 languages. Before she was shot, she spoke 3 languages, Pashto, Urdu and English. And when she woke up, she could still speak 3 languages, understand and speak 3 languages fluently. So obviously those areas of her brain that I was worried about weren't affected at all. And really what rehabilitation she needed was to get stronger. She needed a protection over the part of the brain that had the skull removed, and she ended up with a titanium plate covering that part of her brain. And she also needed a cochlear implant to restore her hearing in her left ear. The hearing in her right ear is completely normal, and now with a cochlear implant she's got good hearing in her left ear. But those things were an important part of her rehabilitation. Psychologically, I can't say how it affected her, because she woke up and said that she had a second life. She woke up in a foreign country with people speaking English. Now, she understood English, but she woke up in a foreign country without any of her family, because you guys weren't able to travel to England. It was planned that your dad would come with her, but you guys weren't able to come, and your dad didn't want to leave her brothers and her mother behind, so he stayed behind. He knew that she would be well looked after and that he would be able to join her very quickly. But of course, your sister woke up not knowing where they were. And when you wake up from a drug-induced coma, your ability to remember things that you're told's not brilliant. So she kept asking where your dad was. Either she wasn't remembering that he was back in Pakistan, or she wasn't believing us. And to begin with, she thought he might be dead, that there might have been an explosion, and the reason he wasn't arriving was he might be dead. When she was able to speak to him on the phone, she realised he wasn't. But the other thing she was worried about was who was paying for the treatment, because of course she knew that medical treatment was very expensive. So she wondered if he was at home selling things to pay for the treatment. So she obviously had a lot to process immediately. And once you guys came, she seemed fine. She seemed not to be traumatised by it all, which is, I've always thought was quite extraordinary, that she never seemed traumatised. I knew the first time I met you on that top bunk bed, you looked like a frightened boy. I know that you and Atal have had a difficult time dealing with all of that. And I also know that, it was difficult to uproot your lives and come to school in England and leave your friends behind. And I know that Malala found that difficult, but she's never spoken about it being difficult. Whereas I know you guys have said, I don't see my friends, my cousins anymore. And they were a huge part of my life. So, you guys have all had a trauma of being uprooted. Your sister was shot, she nearly died. But you guys had to leave the lives you had back in Pakistan and come and make a new life in England.
Her physically, she was quite damaged. Her face was swollen. They also cut a bit of her hair.
Yeah.
And it was very sad. Like, my parents, they were crying for up to 6 months that, they took the beauty, they took Malala's smile away, they took Malala's beauty away. Did you, people get a little scar and then they are worried about it. Oh my God, a little deformity. And for her to not let that, maybe she was affected by it, we don't know, of course. But some people just literally throw their lives away, right? Over some of their insecurities. Were you worried that that might play a part in her going into depression or becoming nihilistic?
I never saw any evidence that it did, so I wasn't worried about it. Her facial nerve on the left side was damaged. Now, the facial nerve moves your face, and we always knew that there would be repair and some help to the facial nerve. To begin with, she couldn't blink her left eye, and she couldn't smile at all on the left side, so it was a very lopsided smile. And I think the only evidence that I saw that she was at all self-conscious was she didn't smile much. She found it difficult to smile, even when everybody else was laughing.
Yeah,
She
she would
would
cover her mouth.
she'd cover her mouth.
Yeah.
That was the only evidence I ever saw that she found this difficult. As time's progressed and there's been healing of the nerve, her face is far more symmetrical and she's got movement.
She's beautiful, and her smile is beautiful. Like,
she always was
it's
beautiful.
such a blessing that,
Yeah.
you know, not only no disabilities, like for example, speech difficulties, but she got her beauty back, she got her voice back. When Oxford graduated,
Yeah.
Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, it is a miracle.
Now that we're in this post-COVID era, the UK and the whole world has been affected severely because of COVID. So how do you think the UK handled it? The UK government, the NHS, what was our response to COVID like?
There were things that every country could have done better. And certainly in this country, there were things that we could have done better. We could have handled the lockdown faster. We could have behaved more as they do in the East, wearing masks. We could have supported the vulnerable better. So I think there are things that we could have done better. I think we were very lucky that we were able to order vaccines faster and get vaccines available faster in this country, partly because we had the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine made in this country, and we also had the availability to buy the Moderna vaccine, so we were able to vaccinate our population faster than most other countries. But that was down to luck and good purchasing, and some strategic thinking by the people who got the vaccines. But of course, us having the vaccines meant that other countries didn't. So is that a win? It possibly isn't.
It's a weird ethical...
It is a very difficult ethical dilemma. So, you know, I think we did it ethically within this country in the sense that we vaccinated the oldest and most vulnerable first. It wasn't a case of those who could pay or those who could get to the front of the queue. We actually did it ethically. But there were other countries that perhaps we should have been vaccinating the rest of the world's old people before we vaccinated younger people in this country. I think COVID, you know, the way it hit the whole world, we did do some things together worldwide, you know, locking down and stopping travel. So I think the world became a closer place during the pandemic, but getting out of the pandemic, it was very difficult, and I don't think that the way vaccines were shared out around the world was quite the way that perhaps was the right ethically.
And regarding the vaccines, a lot of people were very concerned about them because mRNA vaccines had never been used before. Did you ever have any concerns about that yourself, or were you not worried?
No, I wasn't worried about it at all. I understand the medicine. All drugs have side effects. The side effects and the adverse effects were very low. And let's face it, we wouldn't be sitting in this room together if we'd not managed to vaccinate most of the world and get rid of the COVID problem. No one country can behave differently when we're looking at a global threat from an infectious disease. And the other thing is, I think the way that we behaved around vaccine development was absolutely superb. Government worked with Big Pharma to sort out vaccines quickly. So I think we have to take the lessons learned from that. And we also need to look at how we looked after the population. There was a lot of camaraderie and goodwill. You know, we looked after elderly people. People went shopping for older people who couldn't get out to the supermarket, things like that. We became a global community, and communities reached out. You know, people who didn't speak to their neighbours before got to know their neighbours. And I think there was a really important lesson there, that we share this planet and that we have to look after each other. And let's face it, we need to look after the planet a bit better as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also made people more aware of the role healthcare workers play in society and how important they are. Because in the UK, we had, even though it was a very small gesture, just clapping for healthcare workers.
Yeah, 8 o'clock on a Thursday, everybody clapped for the healthcare workers. Yeah, we were deemed to be key workers, and we got to go to the supermarkets first. Yeah. Everybody's important in society, you know. If there weren't bankers, we wouldn't have money. We just have a different job. Healthcare workers and people who work in social care interact with people when they're at their most vulnerable, and it's actually a privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's why it was a bit surprising coming out of the pandemic that there was kind of no reward for that, because a lot of people expected that, okay, the junior doctors have been asking for a pay rise, doctors in general have been asking for a pay rise, they've worked so hard, this is going to be the time. And then we came out of the pandemic and nothing happened.
Yeah, I think part of that's political and part of it's probably economic as well. You know, we did go into some difficult economic times immediately after the pandemic, but I do believe that if we want a good health service, we need to reward healthcare workers properly. And let's face it, we do need a good health service to keep the population healthy. You know, people want a strong NHS.
Yeah, I think you can't disagree with that. And also, what do you think about politicians playing a role in medicine? So, for example, Matt Hancock was the health secretary and he had no experience, no understanding of medicine. For me personally, I can't understand why that would be the best way to go about it, instead of having someone who actually understands medicine in that role.
So the NHS is run by health managers. So health managers do understand healthcare. The Department of Health dictates political policy. And political policy is what the country vote for. So at the end of the day, we get the government we vote for. And that's how democracy works. I personally believe that we need a stronger, better funded NHS. That's because I work in it. I also believe that we need a stronger, better funded social care system. The problem is the country's not as wealthy as it once was. GDP's not as strong as it was. So I think politicians have a tough job to do, but I do think that they could make different political choices. I think that there are countries where higher taxation leads to a happier and healthier population. So political choice is partly, in a democracy, is down to the individuals who vote for the government that we return to government. So I think it's more complex than just saying we need to fund the NHS. I do believe that we need to fund the NHS, but I understand how we end up in a position that we have politicians who don't want to fund the NHS more than it is already funded. The other thing about health secretaries, I've met a few of them in my time, and there are some of them who are very, very well informed on their brief and really understand healthcare and understand patient safety. So the job of a health secretary is a difficult job, and some of them do understand their brief very well. But I would like to see a more arm's length relationship between the Department of Health and Social Security and the NHS. I'd like to see the NHS better funded with more opportunity to run itself the way that the NHS sees fit, rather than the way politicians believe the NHS should be run.
Why do you think people were anti-vaccine and didn't believe in COVID?
That's a complex question. I think people, when they're threatened, look for answers, and sometimes look for answers in alternative places. So there was a lot of social media that was anti-vax. I think there are some doctors and healthcare workers who are anti-vax, who spread a very very dangerous message. I think there are people who are frightened of the unknown. And I also think that there's a lack of trust in medicine. So there are populations who, within living memory, have been experimented upon without the permission of the individuals in that population. If you belong to a group, an ethnic group or a societal group that has, at the hands of medicine in an ethical framework that no longer exists, but you have been experimented upon, your trust in modern medicine will be low, and you won't believe that vaccines are helpful, and you will believe the alternative reality that vaccines are dangerous and not helpful. I'm very pro-vaccine. I know how they work, and I know that they give enormous benefit, and I know we wouldn't have got out of the pandemic as quickly and safely as we did without vaccines.
Some may say that the vaccine companies have, done it for their own profit, and because it was such a rush process, right? These were the quickest vaccines ever made, that they did not go through the procedure, the trials that they should have gone. So do you think that criticism holds any validity?
So 2 questions in there. I think one's about profit and one's about rushing vaccines. In terms of profit, the vaccine companies are part of a capitalist society where companies do make profit. But the vaccine manufacturers, drug manufacturers, don't actually make as much profit as you might think, because they've got huge overhead costs for research. So the reason we got the vaccines out so quickly was the companies had done a lot of research to basically develop what we call vaccine platforms, to be able to put in a bit of a virus or a bit of RNA to be able to develop the vaccine quickly. They had developed 90% of it, and they were just waiting for a virus to come along to be able to use that bit of virus and make a vaccine for it. Most of it had been designed. And that, of course, takes money. So there will be profit, although one of the companies, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, was made and was cheap and was going to be, and was supplied, I think, at cost to countries that couldn't afford vaccine. So I don't think that the vaccine manufacturers did anything immoral around the vaccines, the vaccine development and the subsequent charging mechanisms for it. So that's the first thing. The second thing were they rushed out? Clinical trials, the way research is done, there are lots of checks and balances done, but there's also a lot of time where not much is happening. So I've seen research moved out and it gets put on somebody's desk and they're going to do something else. Remember, in the middle of COVID, nobody had anything else to do. So all of the paperwork was done that day. Nobody said, I'll do that paperwork tomorrow. I've got a different meeting to attend to today. So everything was truncated, but no steps were missed out. So these vaccines got to trial, first in human, check they're safe. They did that, they're safe. Now we're ready to go to the next phase of the trial. So it was really important that we did this as quickly as possible because the world was waiting for a vaccine. But it was also really important that we didn't cut corners, that the scientists didn't cut corners, and the scientists didn't cut corners. It was just that the fallow time, the time where people were off at other meetings or doing their other projects, everything was focused in on vaccine development, such that it was possible to do it very, very quickly. There were huge resources put into it to check that these, they ran trials in multiple countries all at the same time to check that the vaccines were safe and that they were effective. Now, normally we wouldn't do that because we just wouldn't have the resources, the money, the time, the manpower to do it. But everything was put into developing these vaccines as quickly as possible to make sure that they were, one, safe and two, effective. And let's face it, the scientists did that. The scientists and doctors who ran these trials did exactly that.
Do you think people should have been given choice whether they should take it or not?
People were given choice whether to take it or not. It's just they couldn't travel if they hadn't had the vaccine. And that's true of vaccines that have been there for literally decades. So the yellow fever vaccine, you need a yellow fever vaccine to go to parts of Africa and parts of South America. And you can't get back into countries without yellow fever vaccine unless you've got a certificate to say that you've had that vaccine. The yellow fever vaccine has been around for years, and you can't travel to certain parts of the world without a certificate. The same was true of COVID. It wasn't any different, but you could always take a decision not to travel. And actually, in the middle of COVID and immediately after COVID, very few people were travelling. People were very reluctant to travel, even though they were fully vaccinated. So people actually chose, despite the fact they were vaccinated, not to travel. So people did have choice about vaccine, but they just couldn't travel.
I've heard a lot of people say that they're experiencing health side effects from the vaccine now as well. Like, I haven't seen any statistics, but people are saying like there's a lot of athletes now suffering with heart disease at a young age compared to before. Have you seen this trend in your hospital with young people suffering more with heart disease and issues that they didn't have pre-COVID?
So I think the first thing to say is to remind everyone how dangerous COVID was, and that young people died of COVID. Far more young people died of COVID and had serious side effects of COVID than ever had with a COVID vaccine. And a vaccine is designed to protect, and it's given the population a huge amount of protection. We can't figure out, many people had COVID and have got long COVID and side effects of COVID, brain fog, that now they're beginning to describe that as a problem with tiny blood clots. That's probably COVID and not to do with the vaccine. We recognise that there were some problems with the vaccine. It was recognised there were AstraZeneca vaccine was stopped being used for the under 40s because of issues with the AZ vaccine and the fact that young people were less at risk, and everybody moved. The young people got the Moderna vaccine. So there is no medicine that is completely safe. However, on a balance of risk, the vaccines were far safer than wild-type COVID, whether it was original wild-type COVID, Delta or Omicron, and we're actually now facing another outbreak of COVID. There's a new variant that is causing quite severe symptoms, although nobody seems to be dying. People are being hospitalised with the new variant of COVID that's out there now, and we're looking at revaccinating this winter our older vulnerable population to try to protect them again.
I found that earlier point really interesting as well, because I had never heard it before, that basically 90% of the vaccine was already ready. I'm surprised I've not heard that anywhere. Surely that should have been part of the push to get people vaccinated and to counter the misinformation around the vaccine as well. But also regarding that, how come they didn't test like a prior virus, just test it with that, test the mRNA vaccine with that?
I think they were waiting for a bad virus to come along. I don't think that, it was relatively new, and mRNA, other treatments of mRNA are out there for rare diseases. So it's not like mRNA hadn't been used in clinical practice before. We had used it in some clinical practice. They were working up a whooping cough vaccine on mRNA, but it came out after COVID, and they're actually looking at cancer vaccines, which might surprise you, using the mRNA platform. So, this is the mRNA platform is a very powerful platform, and certainly in the AstraZeneca using the adeno-associated virus platform that they used there, they had made vaccines with that before. They just hadn't used it for the whole world.
Speaking of the difficult choices doctors have to make, and the health ministers, what's the most difficult choice you have made in your career?
Oh, that's a really good question. Most decisions in medicine are made with families. So it's rare to tell a family what to do. That most families will go along with doctor advice, or sometimes there are 2 or 3 choices and you want a family to help you make a choice because it's not obvious what the best choice is. I think the place that is most difficult is most decisions around end-of-life care are made with a family, and families, when a child's dying, will find that a difficult journey to go on. Difficult to accept the death of a previously healthy child. But most families go through that journey with bravery and grace and understanding, and accept futility and that there is nothing more that can be done for the child. Occasionally, I've found some families, for their own very personal and very valid reasons, find that a journey that they can't walk with the medics and the nurses, and say that we cannot accept end-of-life care. And as a doctor, as medical director, my fellow doctors will come to me and say, occasionally, this family are finding it impossible to accept end-of-life care. We have had the pastor in or the imam in. We've had a second opinion from another hospital. We've had prayers said. We've done everything that we can, and this family still don't believe us. And we now think that what we're doing with our modern medicine is prolonging death rather than giving life. And in this country, in England, if we're in that position, the doctors are obliged to ask a court of law for their opinion. Other countries, the family can insist on carrying on treatment even although it may be prolonging death and never giving life back. But there are countries who accept that. But in England, if a treatment is not in the best interests or is a futile treatment, we shouldn't be in the position that we're prolonging death and causing a child to have a more prolonged death. And sometimes I've had to support doctors go to court, and court is potentially adversarial. But at the end of the day, the Human Rights Act says that you have the right to have your life defended in the court of law, and it's up to a judge to say whether we should move to palliative care or continue intensive care. There have been some high-profile cases that have made the press. In Birmingham, we've not made the press, and I've dealt with some of these families who have grace and conviction that they can't help make this decision. The families I've always dealt with have always said we will accept a judge's decision. So I've never felt it's been adversarial. It's always been dealt with by grace and families being incredibly brave. But there are high-profile cases that have made the press and have felt very adversarial. And no doctor wants to do this. No doctor wants to go to court. No nurse wants to go to court to say that the family aren't allowing this and that the family are wrong and should allow this. But it is a situation that we do find ourselves in, and it's under our medical professional guidance, we have a duty to recognise the dying patient and treat the dying patient with dignity.
Yeah, watching someone deteriorate like that must be so hard and taxing.
It's hard for everyone. The family are praying for a miracle, and we give them time. But if time doesn't give a miracle, we can't, and we know that medically there isn't a way back, and we've had second opinions and been to the ethics groups and had, the family supported and all their questions asked and independent advocates. It's a very, very difficult situation. It's probably one of the most difficult situations in medicine, but it's not something that doctors do lightly.
I find that approach of doctors in this country interesting because euthanasia obviously is illegal here, but in other countries it's legal. And I don't know if it's just me, but I see a little bit of a link there where if someone is suffering, they can ask for euthanasia, but that's not allowed here. Whereas, for example, the cases you gave are where you can stop treatment. Mm-hmm. What do you think the biggest distinction between those two things is?
Euthanasia is an act, a positive act to cause death. What I'm talking about is withdrawing a treatment that's not beneficial rather than giving a treatment to cause death. So ethically, there are important differences for me between euthanasia and withdrawal of intensive care at the end of life, where the intensive care is actually prolonging death rather than giving life. It's an omission rather than an act to cause death.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that as well. For me, it's a little bit like, I don't know if you've heard this before, but when a psychologist asks that question, there's one person stuck to the tracks on one side of the train and then 5 people on the other side. Would you change the tracks to the one person? And it's just such a difficult question because you are then taking it in your own hands to change to that one person. And I feel like that's what kind of euthanasia is like. You're taking it in your own hands instead of just like withdrawing.
Yeah, it does feel more like an act, and that thought experiment in psychology is a really powerful thought experiment. But it's something that we have huge anguish over, but nothing compared to the anguish of the families.
Yeah, definitely.
What advice would you give to young aspiring doctors?
I think one of the most important things in healthcare and in medicine is your colleagues and the support you get from your colleagues. We're never alone in medicine. We're always part of a team, and we're there to look after each other. And I think that is probably the strongest thing that the NHS has, is that we all line up behind the values of the NHS and the values of healthcare and the professionalism and the codes of conduct, that we all believe in that, and we have to support each other.
And then what advice would you give to just young people in general, kids who might just want to not live a successful life, just be healthy and happy?
Great question. The younger generation fills me with hope. I watch you guys doing this. This is just amazing. You know, talking to, you know, somebody who's just, you know, at the end of my career. I'm not quite ready to retire yet, but, you know, I'm in the final part of my career. You guys being interested in what I've got to say is, you know, I'm honoured. But you guys, the younger generation, are clever, they're intelligent, they want to make the world a better place. They want to make sure that the planet's well looked after. There's a lot that you're seeing in the world that the older generations have got wrong. So I'm incredibly hopeful that you'll make the world a better place than I've been able to make it, and my generation have been able to make it.
And it's an honour for us as well to have you on this podcast. Have an amazing conversation and have you as a friend, most importantly.
It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you for inviting me along.